just a little disclaimer first off about this session. It is highly classified. So remember the slogan, what you see here, what you do here, what you hear here, let it stay here, all right? So when you leave here, shh, don't tell anybody what you learned today. So just making sure y'all signed the waiver when you walked in. All right, so hey y'all, I'm Sarah Morgan, and welcome to Cooking with the Calyatron Girls, top secret recipes of the Manhattan Project. And just to get started, I wanted to ask y'all a typical Oak Ridge Manhattan Project era greeting. And that's because this city basically sprang up out of nowhere, and these people were kind of transplanted from like everywhere, all over the country. And so the conversation usually always started with, where are y'all from? So I'll start. I'm from Tennessee. Anybody?
New Hampshire. Illinois. Rhode Island.
Cool.
Watertown, Mass. Buffalo.
Awesome.
Massachusetts.
Yeah. Assuming a lot of people from Massachusetts. Well, that's awesome. So most may associate the Manhattan Project with Los Alamos, but a small town in Tennessee, tucked away and purposely hidden in the rural foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, was pivotal in the creation of the atomic bomb. So Oak Ridge, Tennessee became home to thousands of families and single adults, in particular women from all different backgrounds and doing a variety of jobs in order to support the war effort, from raising a family to working in the factories. These women were working on this project so secretive that they really had no idea exactly what they were actually doing, which was especially the case with the cubicle operators, popularized now by the term Calyatron Girls. So one of those ladies, Opal Talbot, actually made a memorable visit to Oak Ridge slightly over a year ago to celebrate her 101st birthday. Now, she was originally from Kentucky. She moved to the area right out of high school when she, just had graduated, because she heard there was this opportunity for work for women. So surprisingly, she only discovered that nature of her work and her actual duties in her mid-80s. So during her visit, Opal explored the factory where she had worked as a young girl, and this experience was especially profound for her family that came along with her, as they kind of struggled to understand and grasp the significance and the pivotal role it played, altering the course of history and the contribution to the war effort. However, the term Calyatron Girl or cubicle operator had been used back then. You most likely would have been arrested or removed from the city, because talking about what was happening in the factories was a major violation of the #1 rule, which was not to discuss your job. For the wives at the time, as today, one of the most important responsibilities was to keep your family fed. So these personal stories featured in the cookbook have shed a light on a fascinating, misunderstood, and underrepresented era, which I have the pleasure to share with y'all today. So thanks for coming to my session. Cooking Behind the Fence, which I will be referring to, is an amazing glimpse into the lives and the stories of the women and families of the Manhattan Project. So when recruited or brought along or traveled on their own with the promise of well-paying jobs, these brave women, they came from all walks of life to this unknown, mud-covered, brand new city in Tennessee to work on a secretive project in order to end World War II. Now, this simple cookbook showcases the stories of foods and of strangers in an unfamiliar land, brought together by war and supported by supper clubs, bootleg liquor, and, humanity's greatest equalizer, which is the desire to feed those who you love the most, and importantly, again, in that greatest war that the world had ever seen. So throughout the past year, I've been spending a significant time in Oak Ridge, which is just under a 3-hour drive from where I live, around the Nashville area. And my content is on social media, and have recently began to collaborate with the American Museum of Science and Energy in Oak Ridge in order to create some additional content, share the stories of these fascinating women, and these delightful recipes. So with a background in history rather than the culinary arts, exploring and pairing history with food, particularly women's history, has been a fascinating journey. So on my channel, if you check it out on social media platforms, you can discover other historical recipes of the suffragettes and the first ladies. Some of these recipes are really good, some of them are really bad. acquired taste. Beef tongue recently was no good. But along with these narratives, it gives a glimpse into life behind the fence of the secret city and the women who helped end the war, which is what we'll talk about today. So, just to set the historical stage, here's a brief overview of the events leading up to the creation of the Manhattan Project. So after years of reluctance to get involved in what was considered a European war, on December 7th, 1941, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, it forced the United States to join the conflict. So what had been discovered as well was that the Nazis had begun its own path of atomic discovery and had started working on an unstoppable weapon, prompting a letter written by Polish and Jewish scientists in 1939, signed by Albert Einstein, and delivered to FDR in order to alert him that the United States needed to start creating a bomb. So the Manhattan Project was born, and the race to the atomic age was underway. So almost overnight, things changed for families across the country. By May of 1942, prices were frozen on almost all everyday goods, starting with sugar and coffee. They were the first to be rationed. And by the spring of 1943, meat, cheese, fats, canned milk, canned meats, and other processed foods were also added to the list. Now, in the Oak Ridge Cookbook, Edna Briggs shares a chocolate cake recipe that was her favorite because she didn't need a mixer to make it. Most of these ladies didn't have appliances when they moved to the city, but she could also half the recipe very easily if she was low on sugar. So sugar was scarce, but people, including Wanda Massey, also in the cookbook, had plenty to make her peanut butter fudge because she could use her diabetic husband's rations for the sugar. Vivian Joyce submitted a recipe for the first cake she ever baked, a Lazy Daisy cake, and recalls standing in line to buy sugar with her mother, and then, of course, having to walk home from the grocery store because gas was rationed and they didn't have any gas. So she also said it's ironic, she describes the cake as being, quote, "You can be sure that a line will form to help you eat this cake." And it was ironic because lines were a huge problem in Oak Ridge during the war. So in Oak Ridge, families also participated in two very patriotic activities, canning and planting gardens. So Victory Gardens were planted to address the shortages, and they utilized the local orchards for fruit picking, which included peaches and apples. And a lot of the stories involved children who went out to these orchards and picked these fruits for their moms to make cobblers and different desserts, of course, if they had enough sugar. I'm sure the kids just really hoped that they did. But strawberries and blackberries were also prevalent, and Shirley Connerly in the cookbook talks about her cobbler and going out and picking these and also using them for canning. So it's actually estimated that by 1943, 20 million Victory Gardens were planted, and that American housewives alone produced about 4 billion cans and jars of food. So, wow, it's a lot. So one of my favorite stories in the cookbook comes from Jean Lane, and it recalls this challenge of grocery shopping during wartime. This included food scarcity just on top of the rationing. So on one occasion, she went shopping and saw a stack of canned hash that was labeled special, and it didn't need any ration tickets. So she bought the limit, 4 cans, took it home, cooked it up, added some onion, and served it to her family for dinner. Now, it wasn't until later that night when she was throwing away the cans that she realized it was Dash, which was a brand of dog food that she had fed to her family. So, I know, tragic. So I'm just wondering if she ever kind of owned up to that before she submitted this to the cookbook. But she did learn her lesson, and as I'm sure a lot of y'all that are up from the New England area and Massachusetts especially, she was also from this area and decided just to kind of stick with what she knew, which was clam chowder. However, it wasn't, Dot, an early Calytron worker, recalls not being able to be a very good cook during her early years of her marriage either, and she used a lot of Spam in her recipes, so much so that she was thankful for it at the time because it was something she could use and cook and have, but vowed to never eat it ever again. So Oak Ridge is actually just about 30 minutes west of Knoxville, and it was the first site chosen for the Manhattan Project. In 1942 by General Leslie Groves. He had surveyed several locations across the country and decided that this was the best one. Now choosing this site, it actually was supposed to only be one site for the whole entire Manhattan Project in order to put together the entire gadget, which was the plutonium bomb that they used during the Trinity test. However, of course, it was just the first of 3. So due to its remote location and this hideability tucked into these valleys and its access to waterways, railroads, as well as a large abundance of electricity, which was being produced by the new Norris Dam. So it just made it an ideal location. It was codenamed Site X as the Clinton Engineer Works, and the city's footprint was about 44,000 acres, and it actually was listed on no map until after the war. It also quickly became the 5th largest city in the state of Tennessee at the time. Now, the fact that the city was not supposed to exceed the work of about 10,000 people, it very quickly grew to 80,000 people, so it caused a lot of problems. Now, one of the first things built were the fences. The entire city was gated as much as possible during the war in order to, of course, make sure it remained classified and restricted. Hence the title of the city's cookbook, honoring the Manhattan Project, Cooking Behind the Fence. So what wasn't or couldn't be fenced due to tricky terrain was actually secured by 300 armed security guards on horseback, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Now, there were 3 checkpoints in order to get in and out of the secret city, and the need for badges and inspections eventually became normal, but at first, of course, was very frustrating. In Cooking Behind the Fence, Peg Thomas, who shares a recipe for a Scottish recipe for mince, remembers her meticulous preparations to greet her aunt when she arrived from out of state, but forgot to request a visitor's pass. So she ended up having to leave her Aunt Flo, which ironic, I think, and her baby outside the gate in order to acquire one. I mean, Santa wasn't even immune to searches at the gate. On top of these restricted access from friends and family who weren't working on that project, there was, of course, a lot of banned items that just you absolutely cannot bring into the city, which were guns and ammo, but also alcohol. And that was another thing that women did. They were kind of the smugglers. So they would take the alcohol, they would tuck it into their skirts, they would put it under the babies in the stroller, they'd put it in dirty diaper bags, and then they were able to get it in. So they were very resourceful. So one of the main restricted items, however, was a camera. Now, Ed Westcott moved to the area in 1942, and his wife Esther, she followed the next year. She was known as one of the founding mothers of Oak Ridge. And they were just some of these first residents, and his job was to document the story of the Manhattan Project as the only person allowed to have a camera. Now, in the cookbook, Miss Westcott provides a family favorite recipe for what she called Paradise Ridge cabbage. So on a visit to the city, if you go by the History Museum, you may run into Don Honeycutt, who is Ed and Esther's son-in-law, and you'll be able to hear some personal stories. I had the pleasure of meeting him on one of my trips to the city, and you can also just see all of Ed's photos around the city, which pretty much any of the black and white photos that you're going to see on my slides today are all Ed Westcott photos. So new residents not only had to deal with this brand new sprung up city overnight, but housing shortages, long lines everywhere, and the struggle of living in secrecy. However, for many women, this was the first time they had the opportunity to work out of the home, especially in East Tennessee. So they kind of dealt with these difficulties. The pay was also unprecedented for the time, and much more they could really make at any other job. Now, most importantly, they wanted to contribute to the war effort and bring those boys home. But for me, I think it's a little hard to imagine jumping on a bus or a train and taking off to a city in the middle of nowhere where you may not know anyone. You probably will have to live with strangers, and you may not even be able to live with your husband. So it's just something to think about. Although the city had amenities, the time wasn't taken to create actual sidewalks. So they had these boardwalks. So it was a literal mud pit, and there are several stories in the cookbook that reflect one of the main struggles that the women had, including packing a change of clothes in a paper sack and some shoes for when they were riding the bus in Knoxville to go shopping, because people would stare at what they called those dirty Oak Ridgers. So this was all later considered just one of those Oak Ridge experiences. So June Young, who provides a recipe for champagne punch and cheesecake squares, also recalls the day she went to Oak Ridge to apply for a job in some of her nicest clothing, and she also had on some brand new black suede shoes, and she was crossing the turnpike, which wasn't paved at the time, and just was completely mud covered. So she thought, there's no way that I'm going to get this job. But she was actually hired on the spot and became a stenographer for the Tennessee Eastman Corporation, which was the management company for the Y-12 plant. So if you weren't getting stuck in the mud and ruining your shoes and your nylons, you were dealing with housing shortages. So during the war, again, Oak Ridge's population grew so quickly that it just became a major problem. Many families and staff lived in temporary housing, such as hutments and trailers, while others lived in shared housing, such as dormitories and single-family homes. Some of those were cemestos, which were cement and asbestos, and flat tops, as well as apartments. So the housing also used an alphabet system based on the status level as well as your family size. So Colleen Rowan Black, who actually compiled the cookbook, moved to Oak Ridge with her entire family in 1944, and she began working as a leak detector at K-25. Not long after, she met her husband at the facility, Clifford, who was working as an engineer, and they made their way through the alphabet house system, first living in a Victory cottage, then a flat top, then an E apartment, an A house, and finally a D house, which was the best of the best. By the way, her future hubby won her heart by giving her ivory soap flakes from the PX, because at that time it was way more romantic than flowers. So, Helen Jernigan has a fun story about living in a D house with 6 other women on Taylor Road. And when those ladies got married, they moved out, and then other ladies would move in. So I think it's so interesting about thinking about that revolving door of roommates. However, these ladies embraced it. They enjoyed cooking and having dinner parties, where one dish that they served was called the Taylor Road Cheese Shuffle. It was actually a cheese souffle, but they thought it was funny to mispronounce French words when they were young. They also, cutely enough, like to say mercy buttercups. That was one of their things. Now, hutments, which were where the African American community lived, they were located in what was known as Happy Valley. These were the lowest type of housing, and they were 16 by 16 foot plywood structures, and they had a central stove, which would be removed in the summer so that they could cram 2 more people in there. So it varied between 4 and 6 people. They actually didn't even have any windows or screens on there. So they have a reproduction hutment at the Oak Ridge History Museum. If you go to the city, you can see that. Now, when I had the opportunity to visit, we were doing some filming in the hutments, and it wasn't even the height of summer in the South. It was early May, and it was so hot in there that I think we were all sweating within like 2 or 3 minutes. So it would have been really difficult to live in those circumstances. So one of the additional experiences, if you do go see the reproduction hutment, is that's actually the Midtown Community Center from the Manhattan Project era, and it was known as the Wildcat Den by the young crowd. So, of course, segregation was prevalent during that time, and African American men and women actually could not live together, regardless if they had children or anything like that. And they also, of course, could not have access to some of the things within the city. However, one amazing woman found a way to get to spend more time with her husband, and was probably one of the only instances of bribing a guard that would actually work in this situation, which was with food. So Katie Strickland was a janitor who worked at the K-25 plant and was able to take some leftover building material from the K-25 plant, make a couple pans that then she would use to make biscuits on her hutment stove. So then she would take the biscuits to the guards, and they enjoyed them so much that they let her have a little bit more time with her husband before having to head back to the ladies' side. So, I mean, those are quite the biscuits for a booty call, y'all. So today you can actually see one of her biscuit pans on display at the K-25 Atomic History Center in Oak Ridge. So this mysterious town that would become known as Oak Ridge made sure new residents had activities to take their minds off their work and their secret lives and sort of the stress of all of that. So there were movie theaters, bowling alleys, shops, skating rinks, restaurants, community centers, and even sports teams. Jackson Square was the heart of the city, and during World War II was open 24/7 because working around the clock was necessary as an element to creating the atomic bomb and the urgency to win the war. Jefferson Circle, another one of the 3 town sites within the gate, was home to one of the main bus terminals, but also Jefferson Soda Fountain. Much of the original strip burnt down in the 70s, which included the original home of the American Museum of Science and Energy. However, not only did the museum move to their current location, the soda fountain reopened, and I had the opportunity to talk with a local historian, Ray Smith, and not only enjoy the food, but also learn about the origins of the term Calyatron Girl. Now, they even embraced their atomic heritage at this restaurant. They have the K25 Atomic Special. They have the Fat Man Little Boy burgers, and the Y12 Breakfast Bomb. Now, one of the unique events that they held, located on the tennis courts, where especially us ladies wouldn't have to get our shoes too muddy, they started each of these tennis court dances with Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy, and then they jived until they appropriately played Sleepy Time Gal to end the night. So, as another one of those experiences that I got to have and hang out with some park rangers, and I also did some 1940s swing dancing and even earned my junior ranger badge. So if you're ever in town, they're having a tennis court dance. It is extremely fun. The city also boasted a very diverse religious background. They had the chapel on the hill, and it was used for a multitude of different faiths, which also included a Jewish community that is one of the most unique in the South. Now, one of the prominent members of the Jewish community at that time was Charmian and Waldo Cohn, who moved their family into an F house in 1943. So her husband worked as a biochemist who developed techniques to actually separate the isotopes. But he was also a talented cellist and was integral in forming the Oak Ridge Symphony Orchestra. He was also very instrumental in desegregating Oak Ridge schools, which was amazing because it actually was done in September 1955. So before Rosa Parks' bus boycott, before the I Had a Dream speech, and the entire process was done with no violence and actually very little media coverage whatsoever. So one of Ms. Cohn's most requested recipes for these symphony get-togethers, various community events, including the Sisterhood of the Jewish Congregation annual food fair, and was actually served to world-renowned scientists, was her broccoli soup. So the ladies, of course, had a very interesting dynamic behind the fence, which had to have been interesting since secrecy was of the utmost importance and employees were not allowed to talk with one another about their jobs. So they couldn't share their day, with their friends, spouses, or even really their coworkers who had other positions of employment within the city. So they did, of course, get together for morning coffees, which is reflected in a recipe from Kay for sour cream coffee cake. And they also attended bridge clubs and sewing circles. But as Violet recalls in the cookbook, they could basically talk about anything except what their husbands were working on at the plant. Another struggle was riding the bus because the majority of those who moved to the city didn't own a car. So the ride was not a great experience unless you were meeting your soulmates, as many women did on what they were later referred to as bus dates to the big city. Others, such as Wanda Freeman, remembers that the bus to the grocery store is fine, but riding it back with a baby on one hip and the groceries on the other was really difficult. Speaking of groceries, Betty Culver shares a noodle recipe in the cookbook, recalls pushing a stroller to go get groceries through the mud, which developed muscles that she had no idea she had. So this also taught her to create simple meals from the staples that she already had on hand at home. So many of the women waited to decide what they would be cooking until they went to the grocery store to see what was in stock. Also, in the early days of Oak Ridge, Chris Linehan never knew what she was going to prepare until dinner, until she actually went to the grocery store, of course, and she won't ever forget the menu that she served to her husband's friends from the plant who came over for dinner right after the pineapple truck had came that day. So She had so much of the fruit, she had an entire menu revolving around it that included pineapple juice cocktails, a pineapple and ham entree, pineapple salad, and finished it off with the pineapple upside down cake. Some women, such as Mary Cussman, who provides a lasagna recipe, chose not to cook in the early days living in her G house because they didn't want to stand in line for groceries and instead took advantage of one of the many cafeterias and canteens, even though they had long lines too. However, and I can totally relate to this, she recalls a perk of eating out was you didn't have to come home and do dishes. Many other residents experienced food from other countries and other parts of the country itself that they'd never had before because, of course, Oak Ridge was filled with all of these brand new people from everywhere. Southern ladies shared grit recipes, while Northern women shared recipes such as New England rum pie, which Nancy Levitt explains was a traditional way to end a meal in the region. So I'm not sure if any of y'all have known about that, and hoped it may start a new tradition in the South. Another way these ladies formed friendships was swapping recipes with one another, and some were from the Depression era, which worked well with rations. Now Colleen Black, this was actually, is this not lovely? This was her wartime slogan. I love it. Now she provides an eggless, butterless, milkless cake, which she describes as not only ingredientless, but tasteless. Yeah, doesn't sound good. But not too bad if you topped it with frosting or whipped cream. But that kind of made its rounds around that Happy Valley in 1944, and it was actually given to her by another resident waiting in line for a shower in the morning. Because if you did live in Happy Valley, it was a communal shower. Now women played an incredibly integral part in the war effort by doing what was normally seen as men's work. They made sure essential industries continued operating while the men were on the front lines. However, the difference was that while some women in other fields knew what they were doing, most of the ladies in Oak Ridge had a very different experience. So imagine being so secretive within this gated, extremely protective city that you couldn't really speak to your coworkers about what your job tasks were. Many of these women also worked in a variety of important jobs, ranging from teacher to homemaker to scientists and plant workers, which also posed another challenge in regards to cooking. So Dorothy Silverman, she recalls not having much time to cook, so she used her Presto cooker about 6 days a week. Several of the recipes are also make-ahead recipes. Of course, you might know that when you weren't going to be able to cook, and that includes Jane Manley's spaghetti chicken casserole, described as quick and easy. Another example is Ellen Kife's beef brisket, which can be fixed weeks ahead of time and then frozen. Now, Ellen and her husband Harvey, who's pictured here, moved to Oak Ridge in 1944, where he began work as a chemist at the Y-12 plant, and later he advocated for the creation of the Manhattan Project National Parks. He recalled that he and some of his coworkers were pretty certain they knew what the uranium was being used for, but they weren't certain until the atomic bomb was dropped. Now, other women acted as spies, helping to keep the best kept secret of all time, whether they wanted to or not. Now, Helen Brown, who was actually only 18 at the time and worked at Y-12, she was asked to keep tabs on her coworkers. And then if she overheard them talking about their job or things that they weren't supposed to discuss, then she had reports that she had to fill out, and then they were submitted to the fictional Acme Insurance Company based in Knoxville. So a very strange dynamic to always wonder if somebody is listening to you or they're going to report what you're saying, and kind of a difficult way to make friends. So everyone that you potentially met may be trying to get information for villainous reasons. So this endeavor also shed light on female scientists of the time, including Lise Meitner, who was critical in discovering nuclear fission, and in Oak Ridge specifically, Virginia Coleman, who worked at the Y-12 plant as a chemist. Now, during the Manhattan Project, nearly 10,000 young women were recruited to work at the Y-12 electromagnetic isotope separation plant. Their job was to operate the racetracks, or arrays, which separated the heavier uranium-238 from the lighter uranium-235. Now, each machine could only actually extract a tiny fraction of an ounce of uranium each day, even with them running around the clock. Originally hired, again, as what they were known as cubicle workers, later the Calytron girls, raised and lowered the voltage on machines that were such powerful silver electromagnetics, they could suck the bobby pins out of your hair and make screwdrivers stand on end in your pockets. And these were the largest magnets in the world at the time. I just can't imagine working in that environment, not really being able to ask what was going on. I don't understand. So these remarkable women operated 1,152 Calytrons and produced 140 pounds of uranium-235, the key fuel for Little Boy, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The majority of these women were very young, most of whom had just finished high school. As a result, project administrators initially worried about their age and inexperience given the critical nature of their work. However, these atomic ladies' efficiency in operating the Calytrons surpassed that of trained scientists, because the scientists just asked way too many questions, and they had the unique ability to overanalyze the work, and they just simply got the job done. Since the project was so vital to winning the war and Y-12 was working around the clock to produce the uranium, they ended up building K-25 as an additional enrichment plant. The U-shaped plant that ended up being the largest structure in the world at the time was over a mile long, 4 stories high, and needed a bicycle to get from one side to the other. So many of the more slender and strong women worked as climbers, which also included Colleen Black, who did that all over these immense vacuum tubes, checking for leaks. August 6th and 9th, 1945, revealed to the world what the secret city had been doing. Many of those who worked on this project, from the ladies running the Calytrons to homemakers and scientists, felt conflicting emotions after the development of such a catastrophic device. That all these emotions range from fear, concern, relief, but most importantly, the question of what happens next. Either way, there was a celebration in Jackson Square and excitement amongst those who worked on the project, because it did mean the war was over. After the news, some people started packing up and going back to where they came from in their hometowns, but many stayed and built their lives in Oak Ridge, which is one of the most kind of endearing aspects of this community. These families built something more extraordinary than anyone could imagine, a lasting heritage to this day. Either way, these women with their fellow Oak Ridgers were able to keep one of the biggest secrets in history while ushering in, the atomic age. The entirety of the Manhattan Project was an extraordinary endeavor that, of course, would never be imaginable again. Oak Ridge isn't just one of the 3 main secret cities of the Manhattan Era Project to me. It's just this amazing community in East Tennessee that's not only proud of its previous contributions to ending World War II, but its continued endeavors in the field of nuclear energy. The Oak Ridge National Laboratory houses the world's fastest supercomputer. This facility has also shed light on questions involving President Kennedy's assassination by confirming that the bullets that killed JFK came from the same gun, and also proved Zachary Taylor was not murdered by arsenic, which you can see his fingernail samples on display at AMC. Also, the very first isotopes used for the treatment of cancer were delivered to a St. Louis hospital less than 1 year after the conclusion of World War II. So, as a kind of a passing thought experiment, consider the lives saved by the radiological cancer treatments worldwide that were born out of the original research which brought those weapons and the atomic age to a world stage. So, visiting some of these locations today are reminiscent of the city in those original town site days, but much has changed. In Jackson Square, the Tasty Big Ed's has replaced Williams Drug Store, but continues the tradition of historic preservation with memorabilia that you can view while you eat some delicious pizza. An interesting note about pizza, it was not popular in Oak Ridge back in the early days of the Manhattan Project. And Jenny Gelstone in the cookbook talks about passing around a personal pizza recipe, but it was really difficult to make. You had to make it on a cookie sheet because they didn't actually have pizza pans. So a final note for the day. I love supporting and sharing women's history, and through these recipes, I'm hoping that you or anyone that you know who is willing to experiment with some culinary chemistry is granted a connection to the past. So I look forward to continuing my research and writing about these amazing ladies of Oak Ridge and the Manhattan Project as a whole. So I'd like to encourage you to follow my social media channels, primarily on Instagram at Cooking with the First Ladies and online at cookingwiththefirst-ladies.com, which in the upcoming week I will have several of the recipes that you've seen here loaded onto my website, but you can also get all of those on my Instagram as well. Also help me share this incredible history with others with this additional content featuring the First Ladies Library and Museum in Canton, Ohio, which I do virtual programming for quarterly. And for more information about the Manhattan Project and some of my additional content, you can check out the American Museum of Science and Energy in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And if you'd like to order or have your own version of Cooking Behind the Fence, you can visit amse.org and get your own copy. So I thank you all so much for attending today, and thanks.